I think resilience comes down to a couple of major things. Number one, the ability to make a decision when you have to. And
Yeah.
second, resourcefulness. Being able, because as an entrepreneur and you're one, and I'm trying to be a thriving when I'm in my building process, is things are always not always pixie dust and sunshine, as we know. I mean, there's a lot of stuff, and it would be easy to give up. But you know what? Every time I try to get to that point, and you've probably been there too, it's like, you know what, is it really worth all this? Think, you know what,
Right.
if I would do this, how could I do it? And if somebody else has done it, so all you got to do is, like you and I do, we'll go to somebody who has done it. And it goes back to what Dan Sullivan's taught us, find your who's for your house.
You're listening to RevOps Champions, a podcast created for B2B leaders to help you align your people, streamline your processes, trust your data, and leverage technology in order to grow your business. Welcome back, everybody. Today, I'm joined by Dave Sanderson, a resilience expert and nationally recognized leadership speaker, best known as the last passenger of US Airways Flight 1549, known as the Miracle on the Hudson. On January 15th, 2009, Dave survived what should have been a tragedy, emerging from the icy Hudson River, alive and forever changed. Dave has since dedicated his life to sharing his lessons learned. He brings a unique perspective on leadership and performance, shaped by both his 37-year career in sales and his real-life experience in a high-stakes crisis. Following the emergency landing on the Hudson River, he became widely recognized for his actions during the evacuation, putting others to safety before exiting the aircraft himself. Dave has worked with Fortune 500 companies, elite teams, including military and high-performance organizations, and leadership groups to translate crisis-tested lessons into practical frameworks for resilience, decision-making, and accountability. That all became real very recently, Dave, when you launched Resilience Partners Group. I'm very excited to hear more about that. Welcome to the RevOps Champions podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm really honored to be here. Thank you.
Dave, so you lived through a real life crisis, and you and I have talked about this a little bit, how, in the past, in the US especially, people didn't really think of crises other than from what they saw in movies. But now with recent history of the financial crisis and then COVID, I think people can relate to crisis a little more than they could before. What is the biggest lesson that moment of Flight 1549 taught you about how people actually perform under pressure?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And you're exactly correct. Even in the last 16 or 17 years, as you and I were discussing, I mean, when this happened in 2009, and we were going through in the United States a recession, a pretty significant recession. Then we had what happened with us on the Miracle on the Hudson. And as we talked about, then you have COVID and other things happen. So I think this up-and-coming generations this is the first instance of having to see what a crisis can actually do and impact somebody's life. So, that day on the Hudson River, I think one of the things that you realize is, people fall back on the moments in their preparation. And fortunately for us that day, we had a captain and crew who were very prepared, who I talk about state management, how to manage your mind. They had to manage their minds before anybody else had to, because they had to exhibit that mindset, which I think was a very big contributing factor to the outcome. Because I think if you would have seen people panic, crew panic especially, then that translates. But I think one of the things I've learned that day and I really talk about is people fall back on their moments of preparation. And that's what happened to me, and I think many other people that day. And that's how I think people responded, and why that turned out, went from a tragedy to a miracle.
So, Dave, in your experience, what separates individuals and teams who stay effective under pressure from those who break down?
Yeah, good question. I think what really happens is, the first thing I think is they understand how to manage their state. I talked about that a moment ago, how they manage your mind. And it really starts from three different ways. Either you have to manage your mind in either moving your body through your physiology, the questions you ask yourself, or through your area of focus. So I think one of the distinguishing factors is people who've done that, or are leading and then can handle those, can manage their mind one of those three ways very quickly. Second, they'll be able to address what's needed immediately, which I mean, things come down to 6 primary areas, my world, which I've learned. So if you can identify what that person or that situation is really about, so it comes down to, the situation needs certainty. Does it need a different way or resourcefulness or variety? Does it need something to be you have to connect to something very quick, or does someone just have to step up and manage it? Or fifth, is this calling for how are you going to grow out of this? How you have that mindset of growth, or what can you contribute to it? So I think people who can manage these situations have gone through enough repetitions, put the reps in, to be able to quickly, number one, manage their mind. Second, understand what the situation calls for. And third, which I talked about in my TED talk, the meaning it is. See, most people attach the meaning they attach is not a positive or reinforceable meaning. See, because my thought process and my belief is the meaning you attach to something produces the emotion, and emotion's everything. So whatever meaning you're attaching to that, which a lot of people that day attached, it was devastation. It was, I mean, a plane crash. How can you even get through it? Where some people, the meaning they attached was this actually turned out to be a blessing. This turned out to be something that brought people together in a very challenging time. So those three things, I think, distinguish the people and the leaders when they're going through this, and be able to help them manage that crisis or situation, and be able to make decisions based on that.
Yeah. So, so you've talked about this a lot over the last couple of decades, almost now. So if we bring it back to that day of the miracle, and bring it back to Captain Sully, like what was it that prepared him? Because I forget exactly what the time was, but I know it was a couple of minutes or maybe 3 minutes that he had to make a decision. What led him and what prepared him to make the right decision at the time?
Well, thank you. I think I've had a couple of discussions with the captain, and of course done a lot of reading about him. And I think a lot of people have likewise. Yes, I think number one, his 20,000 hours of flight experience, definitely being in that environment. But second, he was an Air Force pilot, and he was an Air Force pilot during the Vietnam era. So I don't know if he ever was in battle. I don't know if he was. I probably would have found out. But I think just being in that era, being around that, number two. And then number three, even going back to his days, reading his biography, going back to his days when he was, flying planes in Texas, he was having to be able to make those decisions very quickly in those little planes, and having to learn how to glide planes, which that was a skill set that he had to rely on. But one thing that you and I both, we know from our backgrounds and our coaching experiences, is what it came down to is his unique ability. And his unique ability, if you want to narrow this down, this is my belief, is the ability to be able to focus it immediately. Clear the decks, like we talk about, prioritize, clear the decks, right? What can I do best right now? Is the ability to focus in on a problem. And then be able to make a decision based on that. I mean, he made that decision within seconds.
Right.
I mean, if you know the story, it came down to four things in his mind. Number one, when that happened, where he was, he could have gone into the ocean. It was right there.
Yep.
Not a good option, right? Second option is he could have gone into Teterboro, right? It was right there, but too many big buildings. He could have tried to get back to LaGuardia, right? Probably wouldn't have made it based on some of the things we've learned. Or fourth, he had the river. Within seconds, I mean, that took me less than 10 seconds to go through that in my mind. Just think about how to do that and then execute it, right? So I think if you look at the captain, I think that's his unique ability to be able to focus and make a decision.
Right. Because, again, just as a reminder for folks who might have forgotten what happened that day. So both engines were knocked out simultaneously by a bird hit, right? So they took on birds and both engines were gone immediately. So he knew that he had no more power, and the only option he had was to glide to whatever his options were. Did I read somewhere that you were talking about his experience, apart from the thousands of hours of flying and then the training, most likely during the Vietnam era? I think in Texas that I read that he was a crop sprayer potentially at one point. So which again, you were gliding at a very low altitude in order to do crop spraying. So he had that gliding experience, and it's just incredible to see how those things, after years and thousands of hours of training and practice and neural pathways being formed to prepare him for that moment, he realized that landing on the Hudson was going to be the best, the safest option.
And that's one of the reasons I named my first book Moments Matter. It's because what I realized going through this experience, that all the moments in my life led up to that moment. Things that happened to me when I was 12 years old, even when I had to learn how to swim across, when I was in the Boy Scouts and do something that had to serve me that day. So I think everybody on that plane, all those moments in their life led up to that one significant moment. I mean, even look at the first officer, Skiles. He had 20,000 hours of flight experience. So between them, they had 40,000 plus hours of experience.
Yeah.
How many times do you get in a plane when you have two pilots or captains that have that kind of experience? It
Yeah.
doesn't happen too often.
Right. Right. So again, there were a lot of, which is again part of why it became a miracle that day, right?
I
These
agree.
these these are all, to your point, they're all moments. It's a little bit like we talk about in in business leadership that you and I have talked about before, and we surround ourselves with a lot of the same people who you know many of these people have already been incredibly successful, and they're not even halfway there yet. And a lot of it they talk about is they say is luck, but of course we all know that luck often comes from being prepared.
Correct.
I often quote, Gary Player, the South African golfer, who is still, one of the greatest golfers of all time. When a journalist came up to him after he won the U.S. Open in St. Louis and said, "Well, you're so lucky. You're going in the bunker all the time, and you still get it like either in the hole or close to the hole." And his response was, "Yeah, it's funny that the more I practice, the luckier I get."
That's right. More preparation I have, the more opportunities happen. I mean, it's I agree. And I agree. I think it's. I mean, more I'm looking at this, the more I've talked about this. That's why we built our group of Resilience Partners Group, because part of being resilient is organizations that put the preparation in beforehand. I mean, right now with what's going on in the world, right? You better be prepared. You better have a backup plan to get out of China or whatever for
Uh-huh.
supply chain, which we learned out of COVID, right? I
Uh-huh.
mean, at that point, I was really focused more in the consumer packaged goods, arena, and worked with
Uh-huh.
those kind of organizations, which I still do now. But what was their biggest challenge?
Mm.
Supply chain, which no one ever talked about supply chain right before, right? No, who ever talked about supply chain? But now it's
Uh,
one of the top things. But so you better have some resiliency in that area, right?
sure.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so exactly, it comes back down, I think, to the resilience, and resilience is built because of the reps you put in and some of the
Hmm.
losses and things you learn. I mean, the people
So
we know
yeah.
around are not always 100% successful. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah. So let's dig into that a little, Dave. So a lot of leaders, are familiar with resilience. They talk about resilience, but what does resilience actually look like in day to day execution, and not just in extreme situations?
yeah, thank you. I think, and a lot of people think resilience is the ability to bounce back. And I think that is a part of it, being able to bounce back out of situation. But more importantly, it's just the mindset that we're going to get through this, right? The mindset of all the persistence. And I've, and one thing I would go back to what my mother taught me years ago, which I talk about my mother a lot because she taught me these little lessons,
Uh-huh.
is you're not the first person to go through this.
Mm.
So that one mindset started way back means if I've got a problem, I'm probably not the first person to have it. So what do I have to do? Find somebody who's solved it before, which
Mhm.
builds my resiliency up to say, you know what? I've got resources and I'm resourceful enough to be able to get through this. So I think resilience comes down to a couple of major things. Number one, the ability to make a decision when you have to. And
Yeah.
second, resourcefulness. Being able, because as an entrepreneur, and you're one, and I'm trying to be a thriving when I'm in my building process, is things are always not always pixie dust and sunshine, as we know. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a lot of stuff, and it would be easy to give up. But you know
Yeah.
what? Every time I try to get to that point, and you've probably been there too, it's like, is it really worth all this? Think, you know what?
Right.
If I would do this, how could I do it? And if somebody else has done it, so all I got to do is, like you and I do, we'll go to somebody who done it. And
Yeah.
it goes back to what Dan Sullivan's taught us: find your who's
Hmm.
for your house.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. So yeah, I mean, again, a lot. I want to talk a little bit more about some of these, frameworks and things that you've created over the years. But, Dave, where do you see most often execution breakdown in organizations when pressure increases?
Yeah, it is the ability to communicate effectively. And I think that's one thing. If you look back, and I'll use the 1549 experience on that, because people ask me all the time, what was the captain talking to you? What was he saying? He only said what he had to say, and he communicated very effectively. Is your
Uh-huh.
captain brace for impact? All right.
Uh-huh.
Who was he? What do you got to do? And you better, and now it's the time to do it. Right. So
Uh-huh.
I think part of being a resilient leader is being able to communicate effectively the message, which ties back to the mission, which hopefully ties to your value set. Because when a push comes to shove, if you can't fall back on your value set and what you stand for and your mission, no one will actually believe you, which goes back to one central theme: trust.
Absolutely. Which is I mean, again, I think most people are familiar with, if not have read the book, the five dysfunctions of a team. And there are other models out there, but the foundation of every, like in Lencioni's case, it's the triangle,
Yep.
and the foundation is trust. Without trust, you cannot get to the next level and the next level and the next level, and ultimately, if you want results, it all starts with trust. I think that's
Well,
spot
I
on.
agree. And you know a little bit of my background. I swim with Navy SEALs and special operations to raise money and awareness for what they're going through right now. But one of the things that bring that affords me is this: I get to talk to them.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I teach and talk about now is when I go out and speak in my resilience partners group, our resiliency framework is how do you build a high performance team?
Mm-hmm.
And after speaking to these special ops and Navy SEALs, and they're all high performance.
Yeah.
So you ask the question, what does it take to be one? And it
Mm-hmm.
came down to two things. Everyone I talked to, probably talked to a dozen, 2 dozen of them, just to get the same thing: trust and competence.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like those two things. So, and then the next question I asked was, well, okay. I said, probably the optimum one would be someone with both of them, right? If they have a high level of competence, high level of trust, that's the ideal, which is like Captain America, right?
Mm-hmm.
But majority of them don't have a high competence or trust, right?
Sure.
They've got one or the other, or they're not as balanced, right?
Yep.
So now, when it comes down to that, and you got to fill that spot. What are you looking for? And you looking for a lot of competence or a little bit of trust, or just the opposite? And all of them said the same thing. They'd rather have somebody they can trust,
Mm-hmm.
and they can teach competence.
Mm-hmm.
You got to have some competence, right? You got to be able to do some things, but they're looking for people with trust. And when I talk to organizations, it's like, if you want to build a high performance team, build it up based on trust first and then
Yeah.
competence. And what I see with a lot of people who are interviewing, and I mean, I've interviewed for 40 plus years, it always talks about your competence, right? Your background and your resume. Well, that's important. What I think more important is, can I trust you when all stuff hits the fan?
Mm-hmm.
And that's
Yeah.
part of resilience, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because when you're in a sales organization like I was for 37 years,
Yeah.
there's some challenging times, right? They're expecting you to hit that number.
Mm-hmm.
You're forecasting, and they're forecasting your number,
Mm-hmm.
and you better be able to produce.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and that's called resiliency, because if I can't give you trust at that moment, you're not going to trust me to produce them. Why would I trust you to be able to pull the number in, right? How can I
Mm-hmm.
trust you to be working with our potential clients? Can they
Mm-hmm.
trust you? Who are they going to call at 2 o'clock in the morning,
Mm-hmm.
right? When all their stuff's breaking loose. So I think it goes. So what you just said I think is a fact. Because the bottom line, if you only got it, the bottom of the whole thing is trust. If you can't do that, the rest of the pyramid falls down.
Exactly. Exactly. So, Dave, from a leadership perspective, how do you build accountability and ownership without creating fear or friction within teams?
Yeah, and one of the things that I think is one of the things that we've learned from our mutual friend Chad
Mm-hmm.
Jenkins, the VCR framework. And this is one of the things he's allowed me to really talk about, because I think that's it. I
Mm-hmm.
think when you're building these things, you better have a leader who has a vision, understands the capabilities, and knows how to get the reach. Right, the VCR framework. And I think that is the target. I think
Mm-hmm.
everything starts with that. What I've realized after researching this over the last year or so, after learning this with Chad and
Mm-hmm.
working through that, is everything else that I do falls underneath that. If I can't help a leader with a vision, understand where they're going, right? Have the
Mm-hmm.
value sets. Second, understand what capabilities do we have and do not have. And third, how are we going to get those, and who are the best people in my world that can help me get that reach or those resources.
Mm-hmm.
Everything starts in my world, and what I'm teaching now is we start with a VCR framework. Is okay, if we could do that, then all the other frameworks start building into how do we do this, the
Mm-hmm.
execution part. But
Yeah.
this is the target.
Right. Yeah. So again, so it all starts with a vision. Like everything. I mean, everything that exists today started, whether it was a year ago, 10 years ago, or 100 years ago, with someone had a vision, but that vision did not become a reality until they found people or someone who had the capability to make that vision a reality, and someone else. Typically, it's not the same people who do all three. Someone
Right.
else who then has the reach to bring that capability and that vision to the people who can make it real and really derive the value from the original vision.
Well, Steve
Yeah.
Jobs and Elon Musk are ideal. People look at. I mean, Steve Jobs, right? The iPhone, right? He had
Yeah.
the vision, right? Take a phone and put the iPod together. All
Yeah.
right. Not that difficult. Well, he didn't have the capability to do it, right?
Mm.
So he had to put the capabilities together. Hey, and by the way, how am I going to get this in the marketplace when everybody is? What do you mean? I can have my music on my phone, right? Yeah, exactly what you just said is it's usually not the same person, right?
Right.
But someone's got to start with the vision.
Yeah.
And I call ours the big unbelievable goal, right? That big vision that we got, and which is the 3-year vision in our world. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like, people ask me all the time, how are you going to do that? I said, I don't know how I'm going to do it just yet.
Yeah.
But I got the vision, which means I got to change everything we're doing into asking different questions, which bringing different people in our world.
Yeah. Which of course then comes back to, if you layer on that with, so once you have once you have two or more people together, and you now have a team or organization that's starting to do something towards the vision. I think you've mentioned now a few times the importance of values or principles that everyone is working towards, and everybody is being judged on those same values or principles ultimately, to make sure that they're part of the capability that is needed to get to where we're all going together. But it comes back to what you were saying earlier around communication, right? Because then it's that continuous communication and the sort of the beating
Right.
of the drum of like, remember, this is where we're going. This is why we're doing it. Is everybody still on the?
Right. Yep. I
Yeah.
mean, I think the best things are the ones who can quickly and simply remind people of the vision and the mission. And, that one of the things we changed in our Resilience Partners group at resiliencepartnersgroup.com is one of the things I was passionate about, which I've never done before. And it's
Mm-hmm.
nothing new, but we put our values right on the front page so people can actually see what we stand for.
Mm-hmm.
So they know when they work with us that these are the standards that we're playing at. And if you don't want to play at those standards, we may not be the right organization for you. But this is a level, because it goes back to something I learned years ago when I was head of security for Tony Robbins. It's all about raising your standard.
Mm-hmm.
You got to raise standards for people. And
Right.
leaders with vision can raise the standard. And like you just said so eloquently, remind people why we're doing this and what the vision really is and why we're doing this.
Yeah. 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 That's really good. So, Dave, I mean, so you've got decades again of experience and vision and capability that have led to you launching the Resilience Partnership Group or Partners Group,
Yep.
RPG.
Yep.
But part of what made that all possible was all these sort of frameworks that you've developed over time, and also I think you mentioned to me you've created a matrix that makes it sort of is kind of a good place to start to
Yeah.
see, is it almost like a self-diagnostic tool? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. It's we're been working with a couple of different people like you and I talked about. I'm the one third of the equation. They're the other two thirds. But yeah, it's what we've really be able to build is a with 30 question assessment, which you can take in 5 or 10 minutes, and out of that it'll produce a heat map for you, showing you 36 different leadership attributes of where your strengths are, where you need help, and where the gaps are. So then the question is, how do we fill those gaps? And that's when I bring in the different frameworks. Whether you may have a challenge with the reach, right? We talk about VCR. So one of the things that I built over the last 30 years, which I never knew and one of the things Chad taught me, like, was, I give him the credit, I never named any of this till recently. I had them. I
Yeah.
never named them. And this one's name is A-to-I equals affinity, which means access to influence equal affinity. How do you do that? And all I did is take the framework I did in sales over 37 years. How did I get to the C-suite? The question people always would ask me when I was in sales is, they're playing at the IT suite, which is great, right? You need to have that, right? They're technical. But I was playing in the CFO suite. How did you do that? So all I did is now sharing my framework is called named A-to-I equals affinity. How do you get access, build a connection, build a relationship, to get influence, to have an affinity relationship? So that's part of this. Likewise, so if we're going to build resiliency in our organization, you said it again earlier, it's not just you. So what are the relationships we have to find to be able to do these things, right? And you better be able to get to the right people. And this framework just helps you quickly, within seconds, identify the steps we have to do to get there. And you can't skip a step.
Okay.
See, most people want to say, okay, I've got access. Well, right now, I have influence in this organization. Oh, influence takes, going back to what we talked about earlier, trust, right? And you may get trust immediately. That's great if you do, but 9 times out of 10, it takes time, right, to build that trust. So you
Right.
have to build that connection, build a relationship, and then you start by having some influence, being able to help influence that person. Then, well, once you influence, the whole key, I think, and what I've been able to sort of go to the bank with, is build an affinity relationship. And I call it, who are you going to call at 2:00 in the morning, right? And
Yeah.
when all stuff's breaking loose, everybody's great when everything's good. But as you know, being in the CRM and IT world, right, it's at 2:00 in the morning when everything breaks down.
Yeah.
Who are you going
Yeah.
to call? That's when you get affinity. All of a sudden you're having those, you're handling things. That's actually one of the first frameworks we built under the resilience framework that we built is A-to-I.
Very cool. And of course makes total sense because as you're talking about that from sort of a strategic leadership and sales perspective, one of the things that we often get involved in when we're implementing a new CRM for an organization, whether they have 10 salespeople or 500 salespeople, ultimately, and you touched on this earlier too, that salespeople have quotas. And they need to be set up for success. So the quota has to be somewhat realistic. So if they're a competent, trustworthy salesperson, the goal should not be impossible to reach, right? It should be, but the question is, so you touched on a few things there, like trust. In every organization, this differs a little bit. How long does it take to build trust, right? And if that is not built into the life cycle, that is often one of the things that we're measuring, like how many days, weeks, months does it take, especially in the services world, does it take to close a sale? If one of the things that you need to get through, build is trust, if that's one of the first, if that's one of the hurdles that you have to get through, how long does that take? And then are you being realistic about putting that into the life cycle measurement? And of course,
I tell you, if you don't mind me commenting on it, because you brought up something that's extremely important. So when I'll just tell you the story. When I started with Oracle many, many years ago, I had this mindset, right? I had the A-to-I mindset, right? But I didn't articulate it. I just knew how to do it. Well, my manager at that point did not buy into that. His mindset is, at Oracle, we have a process. This is the process we're going to follow, right? So here's Dave going outside this process, right? Dave's going outside the process, right? I said, okay, Dave, we got to wrangle you in. Well, I didn't. So I had to, this goes to the story of what happened on January 15th. I was working with this organization. I went outside that realm. My manager was not happy with me. I would tell you right now, he was not happy with me. But I was sitting in the C-suite at this company, all right? I was COO, CFO, CIO, right? I was working with this company. Then January 15th hits, right? And all of a sudden, I'm going on a plane crash, and I was at that company's location for those 3 days.
So you were leaving that.
I was leaving the third appointment we had in the distribution center in Brooklyn, coming back with this company, right? And the first question my manager asked me is when I got back, because he didn't even check in with me or my wife. So I went by the office and I had these old sweats on because I had lost everything in the plane crash. And he said, "You're going to Michigan next week, right?" And that was the moment, Brendon, I realized, number one, I didn't have my 4 freedoms, which we can talk about later. But second, he didn't understand. He said, and that's why the company that I was working with, and ultimately became my client, told him never to come back in because they knew what he didn't. I built relationships and trust at that level where when I went in a plane crash, those people were taking care of me. They understood what I was going through. When my manager, all he worried about was the dollars. Well, I tell you that for a reason. My vice president at that point started realizing Dave's playing a different game. He became sort of my manager at that point because they had to shift things around. A few years later, I was working on probably the second or third largest pursuit in Oracle that year. And I told his name's Gene. I said, and Gene was then my senior vice president. I said, Gene, I'm going to go outside the box again, right? I'm not going to follow this process. I'll do everything you need me to do, but I'm going for the big boys, right? He gave me a runway, which is totally, and you've been in this world, let's see, abnormal. He gave me a year runway, right, to build the trust. Because Gene knew that I knew what I was doing. Yeah. And my manager wanted to cut me off after 6 months. Right? I said, he's not making progress. Well, a year later, right, all of a sudden we're sitting with the COO, CFO, and this is a $58 million engagement, right? Wow. And we won the engagement, not because we had the best software. Yeah, we could handle it, right? Sure. It's because they trusted us. And that's a point where I think my senior vice president realized what other people were lacking is what that word you just mentioned. And Oracle would usually cut people off because we need a number. Yeah. They didn't want to invest the time into building trust. And that was the A-to-I framework I built. How do you build that trust? And you're right, it's not overnight. So yeah. Which is kind of like, they often, you're reminding me of something which is the soft stuff is the hard stuff, right? Yep. So like when a sales leader or whatever if they're SVP or VP or whatever, if they're running
if they're just running things by the data, data is critical, especially right now.
Yep.
But if you just making all decisions based on data that is not informed by the soft stuff, which is the relationships, the trust, and all the things that are necessary for, especially in the services space, right? I mean,
Right.
in transactions, it's a little bit different, but in B2B services or any kind of services business where someone has to be convinced that they're making the right decision, which requires trust. Yeah, that's often not built into those models, and it really should be, because
And that's
otherwise
one of
it's not.
the first things we teach as a framework is the A-to-I, because I want to show you how to build trust. Because part of resiliency is that, right? When all stuff hits the fan, who am I going to trust? Like what you just talked about a moment ago, is one of the reasons that's so important in my perspective is this, because their job's on the line. They're making a call for you for $58 million, right? And if you make a mistake, right, if I can't trust him, then my job's on the line and probably other people's jobs are on the line. So bridged it perfectly is companies need to build in that time to help build trust. Not only, and the executives all want, they think they can go in. No, it's about building that time and that perspective, right? Where, I never was afraid to get in because my mentor, Bill, back in 1984, when he started, he taught me how to be around executives. Yeah, there's a long story behind that, but how I learned this was in 1984, 1985, when I was with Bill, he was mentoring me on all these things I needed to learn when I was 24 years old. When you think you're Superman and you know nothing, is he put me in the environment around his peer group, which were CEOs around Charlotte, North Carolina, which gave me comfort to be around them and understand what they were talking about. Well, most people don't put that time in, right? They just think they can get right into the CFO and have a conversation and we're on. Now I've got a relationship. No, you got a connection. You got a relationship, right?
Right.
So.
Yeah. Dave, we often, talk about this here at Dynamico as there's emotional intelligence is a big part of this, right?
Yep.
How does that example that you just gave of like when you were learning, when you were 20, 24, 25 years old, you were learning to be in the presence of CEOs and leaders, which was critical to your later success. Where does emotional intelligence come into that?
Yeah, it's and it took me a little time to figure this out. I mean, it wasn't overnight. It wasn't like, okay, you got it now, Dave. I actually just wrote about this. We'll put it out on a blog here shortly. At the moment, it really came to me. Okay, because that's a great question, and because you're going down the path, you're doing pretty well, you're learning, you're still young, but it was an interaction I had because I had built a relationship up with the largest bank in South Carolina, which made the introduction for me to the state comptroller of South Carolina. Now, the state comptroller of South Carolina is the one who controls the funds. So that's like the CFO, right? So now you're in the game, right? And you think you got it going on. You think you've got, and all of a sudden you realize in the conversation when he looks at you, says, "Son." So he says, "Son," I knew I was a problem. "Son." I'm beginning to start thinking about doing something like that. And I said, "Sir, we're 10 years away." He said, "Son, you have no idea. You have no idea what you're doing." And that's when the emotional intelligence starts kicking. It's like, you know what? I can have all this, but I have to be able to sense what's really going on and understand. And have what Chris Voss calls that empathetic conversation, where you can understand with emotion, how to have that interaction. That was the moment back in 1991 that woke me up and said, I better take this seriously and really understand and have, like you just mentioned, emotional intelligence and empathetic listening and these things that we all learn about. And that's what it started really coming together for me in 1991.
Yeah, really interesting. And of course, you mentioned Chris Voss again, who, for those people who don't know, he wrote the book Never Split the Difference. He's famous for his ability to negotiate again in crisis situations. But I think it was Chris that, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dave, that said one of the most, and it's kind of related to what we're talking about. Whether it's you with this comptroller in South Carolina or any situation where there's a difference between power and authority. If you're able to, instead of being on opposite sides of the table, if you're able to move yourself around and sit next to them at the table, is kind of what it all comes. It's like we're going to solve this together. It's not like I'm trying to sell you something and you trying to sell me something. It's how do I come and sit next to you and how do we sort of collaborate and work through this together.
And you said it correctly, and Chris did say that. I had dinner with Chris a few weeks ago in Vegas, and we had these deeper discussions. But it goes back to something you mentioned earlier, and we talked about is until they trust you, you'll never get around that table. So you've got to build some level of trust that you're in it not only for your win, but most importantly for their win and their gain. And if they sense that and they know that, they will allow you to walk around the table and sit next to them. But if they're not, it's going to be adversarial. And Kayla, you'll never get to the promised land. And Chris admits there's a lot of times that they did not.
Oh, absolutely.
Not able to do that. But
yeah,
he did it more often than not. He understood that, and it came down to empathetic listening.
Sure,
right?
sure.
And asking the right questions.
And of course, in a lot of the situations that he was involved and where he got his experience and that he talks about in his book, there wasn't really, it wasn't something like it wasn't like in a sales situation where you can kind of just move on to the next big deal, right? It's like somebody had to solve that situation. It was a crisis and somebody was most likely going to die.
Life and death stuff.
Whereas in sales, of course, this is where it's a little different. And again, good salespeople know when to move on. Right? And say, look, we're not a good fit, at least for right now. So you move on to someone else who you could help, which is a little different. But I think, again, those negotiation skills and the way to communicate and again, trust is all very consistent.
Yep. I agree. It may be a little bit different, but that's, I think, one part of the challenges a lot of companies have likewise. Is you're expected to get that number, so they're going to just beat on you until you get that number. And do not give up. And after a few different meetings, we're not a good fit. We're not the right fit. And I think it took me a long time to figure this out. So I'm not over 37 year plan or program. You learn how to elegantly back out. I think people have more respect for you to say, you know what, I'll be your friend. I'll help you advise, but we're not the right fit for you. We're not, and we're not the right fit for everybody likewise, and what we're doing right now. But I think that what you said is right. Is it comes down to back to trust. And my friend Larry Levine, who he launched his book last year, and I was very going to be right to forward. Is selling in a post trust world. How do you sell in a post trust when no one trusts anybody right now? And that's one of the things I'm really focused on. How do you do this when, like you probably know, being in the United States? Sometimes you can't even go next door to your neighbor and have a conversation anymore. People are so dug in on your opinions. How do you do this? Well, it comes back to the A-to-I and how to really, go from access to building that influence and affinity. And there are steps. It's not overnight.
Yeah. We'll add links to all those, tools and resources of yours, Dave, in the show notes. So as we sort of start to wrap up here, Dave, another question, how should teams prepare for these high pressure moments before they happen? In other words, like, are there systems or habits or behaviors that actually make a difference when these high pressure moments arrive?
Yeah, I'll thank you. I'll go back to 1549 because what really came out of that is the mindset of the high pressure situation when it was a do or die situation for a lot of people, right? Even when he got it down successfully, we have water coming in and you got to get out and you got 150 people, you got to get out, not including the crew. How do you do that? So so what I really did is identified every step that would happen that day. And it came down to decision making. And so the way I help people prepare and how I was prepared to do it is we call it the assess framework. And number one, you have to accept reality, right? You have to have that understand that what is acknowledge the reality that you're in. You have to scan your different options. This comes down to resourcefulness. And how I share that is I looked up and saw people climbing over seats to get out of the plane, which gave me another reference point on, hey, I thought I was locked in on the aisle. So if I'm resourceful, I scan for options. And third step really is you got to select what I call the best next step. And I'm going to go through the whole framework, but this is how how we did it. And I did it. I figured this out. To prepare, if you understand, number one, okay, what is the reality we're in right now? Is it good, bad, or ugly, right? Second, what are my options? And one of the things I learned from Tony Robbins, which I just included, nothing new, is if you think you have one way to get something done, which that day on the plane I did, said, I got to get to the aisle. Well, I realized there were actually multiple options to get out of the plane, right? The thing is, you better have three choices. If you scan for options, what you're looking for is I want to have three choices. Because number one, if you only have one, you don't have a choice. If you have two, you have an option. But three, it gives you a choice.
Okay.
So the second step is, Find three choices, or I talk about scan for options. And number third, what's your select my best next step? Because when you're going through a crisis situation or a challenging situation in business, personal, or in the world, number one, you don't have time to do a 5-year plan. I mean, that's what I tell you right now, as we're seeing in the world, things are changing every 15 minutes. Heck, I went out this morning early to go work out, and the gas listed price was $4.11. I drove back, it was $4.29. I mean, within an hour, gas prices changed. So you got to be able to take the best next step. And which means to me is I scanned my options. They may not be perfect, but what has the lowest risk and highest possibility for reward? So this is part of what I call the assess framework. So the prepared, to answer your question, prepared, if you understand this framework, how to do this step by step by step, then at least you have a way to be able to go forward with it.
Yeah. And I think, just sort of to bring it back to how that lesson was made so real for you, and as you sort of thought back to what you did, on that day on the Miracle on the Hudson, one of the things I realized, Dave, was that if you ask anybody who is aware of that, and most people are, what most people think is that the plane was just going to float there forever, right? Because of course there's no point of taking a picture of the Hudson with nothing on it because the plane is sunk. But of course, you and everybody on the plane knew that this is not going to just float there for until everybody's off. It's going to sink, and I think that's what really changes. I don't know, how long did it take before it sank?
So from the time of impact to the time, so most people view the plane from the front.
Yeah.
That's why in my book I showed the plane from the side, because the back of the plane was actually underwater immediately. So in 24 minutes, from the time that thing hit, 24 minutes, it was nose up.
Right.
Okay. 24 minutes.
So, and nose up means that again, if you were in the nose, which is the cockpit, that was the only way that you were still alive. But then the getting out of that was a different issue.
Yeah. The pressure, that's one thing I understand, how people understand. You have that water pressure, right, coming in. And I give a lot of credit to the people who got those doors out. Because number one, you're going through a crisis situation. You have to execute. And now you got water pressure against that to get it up and out. Those doors are 42 pounds. Plus you got water pressure. So what you just said is correct. Sometimes things just start compounding, right? There's one on top of the other. They start stacking. And as we know, when it comes to emotional intelligence, the more you stack in your head, the harder it is to get out of your head. So that's why when I coach people, if they're going through a crisis, just get it out of your body, because the more it stacks in your body, it's harder to get out. And the people who are the most challenged are the ones that keep saying the same thing over and over in their heads, are stack, 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 stack. And all of a sudden you can't get out. You're sinking in a plane, right?
Right. Yeah. Wow. Dave, okay. So to wrap up, so looking ahead, as environments become more complex, I mean, we already sort of touched on this. You mentioned how we're living in this very low trust society right now, unfortunately, and obviously we're hoping it's going to change soon. So looking ahead, as this environment becomes more complex and fast paced, how should leaders rethink performance, resilience, and decision making?
Yeah, I think the leaders right now have to start asking different questions. And I think that's the biggest thing is, and one of the things that we learn through in our coaching world that you and I are involved with, sometimes, we don't ask the right questions. So one of the great things I've learned going through our coaching program is I now have tools to be able to help me get clarity on the vision and clarity on how we're going to go. And so when I coach people, as once again, I didn't invent this. All I did is take some things we learned and then just put them into the program where, I was talking about the strategy circle, right? The experience transformers, things like that, where if you're a leader and you can spend 15 minutes identifying the obstacles and the wins and what I want out of this is how I find leaders are now getting things handled much quicker and more effectively. So as we're going through the changes in the world, I think the ability to have clarity and then articulate that clarity to the right people and the right who's is going to be critical. I'm reading a book right now with Ram Charan around how to extricate yourself out of China, right? And it's a fascinating read for me because number one, I was in consumer packaged goods. I was in supply chain for a long time. And that's what was, as we talked about in COVID, was identified probably quickly. Our supply chains are broken, right? But so many people are tied to China now. And what if China just all of a sudden cuts everything off? So leaders right now better have that be able to put those plans together. Those we call an experience transformer in our world, right? What
Mhm.
experience do we want, and what do I have to do to start extricating myself? What other places are more resilient, such as India, maybe, or Central America? So, just as an example, I think so. I think that there are tools out there, and people have done it. And I'll leave you with this: the biggest lesson I learned from Tony Robbins is this, and this is what I've practiced over and over in my life: is proximity is power. Put
Mm.
yourself around people who've actually done something and done it, and that will compress the decades it takes to get that decision down to days. And all of a sudden, you're advancing your cause and advancing your to your what we call our unbelievable goal.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice, and it actually reminds me of similar advice that many successful people will give you is join peer groups. Surround yourself by people
That's right.
who've most likely had a similar experience that you're trying to currently overcome or figure out the best way through. Again, it's you're not going to do that in isolation is going to be really
Yeah.
really hard.
Yeah. And that's what
And
happened to
again, just
COVID. That's what happened
yeah,
during COVID. We're all in isolation, right? And even though we have the Zoom and that was a great tool, still I go back to something I learned back in 1987, when I was doing my name with Tom Hopkins. This will always be a belly to belly business, even with AI, right? AI is just a tool. It's going to come
hmm
down to relationships.
yeah,
It will always come down to that belly to belly. And can I trust you, Brendan? Can you trust me? Right? And if that's the case, then we can build on something. Like you said, two people, we can start building on something.
yeah, yeah. Dave, any last words of advice?
No, I appreciate the opportunity because I think this is such an important topic right now, especially for entrepreneurs, because we're all going through challenges. I mean, one thing my coach told me, and she was right, and you may know Teresa, and she
hmm
told me that you're really not an entrepreneur until you start facing challenges such as making payroll, right?
hmm
And I mean, I never thought of it that way until I had a challenge a few months ago making payroll. So that resilience thing that had to come out, right? It's these lessons I had to learn. And fortunately, I've been able to put myself around people who've gone through it or can
Yep.
at least educate me. So I guess the last message is find somebody like a Brendan or myself. If you don't have a situation, a challenging situation, whether it's in your business world, your personal world, that they can give you their wisdom. Because the last
hmm
thing my mentor told me, my first mentor Bill told me before he passed away in 1997, was this. And this is one thing. This is the reason that I do what I do right now. You talk about the reason is he told me, do not let what I taught you die with you.
Mm,
Last thing he said before he passed away. And the reason I'm doing this, the reason you and I are having this conversation is that I'm fulfilling that mission he gave me. So
mm.
everything that you and I have, we need to give it away. We need to mentor somebody else. We got to make sure we pass it on with gratitude.
Right. Yeah, I love that. And I think going back to the thing you were saying right before that, which essentially comes back to the same advice that your mother gave you, which is if you're going through something, it's likely many other people have
Yep.
gone through
Yeah.
that same thing before. So find them and they'll help you figure out how to get through
You're not special. You're
it.
not special, right? And that was my
Yeah.
boss term. You're not special, right? So,
Yes. Yes. Really good. Dave, thank you so much for joining me today. It was great to catch up.
thank you. Same here.
And best of luck with RPG. I look forward to following and diving into that more.
I look forward to having conversations with you and what you do in your world about it. Likewise. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.